Hello, thank you for joining Alliance for Science Live. Since the start of the year, American consumers have been seeing something new in the grocery store as food manufacturers begin disclosing bioengineered ingredients in their products. Greg Jaffe, the Alliance for Science Associate Director of Policy Affairs, is here to walk us through the disclosure rules and share some of his findings from a recent trip to the grocery store. We'll leave plenty of time for questions, so you can post them in chat or the comments section on Facebook. Greg is an international expert on agricultural biotechnology and biosafety who earned his law degree at Harvard. He's also the director of the Project on Biotechnology for the Center for Science in the Public Interest. One thing I recently learned from Greg is that this is not a labeling law. So what else can you tell us, Greg?
Well, thank you, Joan. Let me share my screen and I'll start the presentation. And I hope that people will provide questions and discussion afterwards, because I think this is a topic that maybe shouldn't be as confusing as it is, considering this is information for consumers, but it is a pretty confusing topic. So I'm gonna, my title talk is ABCs of the new bioengineered disclosure requirements in the United States. And what I really hope to do in the next half hour or so is to give you a little background on the law, what and how of disclosure, what gets disclosed and how it gets disclosed, talk about the exemptions. And then, as Joan said, the fun part is I went to the supermarkets in my neighborhood and I went to see how are food manufacturers and retailers complying with these requirements. And I'll show you a lot of different products and what they're actually doing in those situations. So this is called the National Bioengineered Food Disclosure Law. It was signed by President Obama on July 29th, 2016. And that law required the United States Department of Agriculture's Agricultural Marketing Service to implement the law. That's the same office that implements also the organic standard, which many of you may be familiar with. And it required USDA to come up with regulations to implement the law 2 years after it was signed. It took them a little longer than that. They did it in about 2.5 years, but in the end of December, they did issue final regulations with an implementation date of 2020, meaning companies could start implementing it then, but with a compliance date of January 1st, 2022. So that is the time period today, just a few, last month, when companies had to disclose this information. So that's sort of the background on the law. So of course, the first question one asks is, what needs to be disclosed? So what is disclosed? And so we look to the law, which has the definition of a bioengineered food. And a bioengineered food is any food that contains genetic material that has been modified through in vitro recombinant DNA techniques, and for which the modification could not otherwise be obtained through conventional breeding or not found in nature. And so the issue that arises here is, what contains genetic material? And that became a fairly controversial issue in the rulemaking process, because there were many people who felt that anything that came from a genetically engineered crop or animal should be labeled, any ingredient, and others felt that only things that contained the genetic material that you were eating, the modified DNA. USDA decided in the end that only things that have modified DNA in it would need to be labeled. So if you have an ingredient from a genetically modified crop or animal that has the modification in it, that has to be disclosed. USDA put together a list, and they update this list every year of bioengineered foods. So according to them, there are 13 plants, crops, and animals, or 12 crops, 1 animal that have genetically engineered varieties associated with them. And so this is really for manufacturers to say, do I have an ingredient from corn in my food, and was that corn genetically engineered? And then is there any modified DNA still in that ingredient? If those answers to those things are all yes, then of course they have to disclose that information. So the next question is, well, how do I make that disclosure? So say a food has a corn product that has milled corn in it, or it has corn flour in it. How does it make that disclosure? And the law says, and the regulations say, that it's the food manufacturer or the food retailer, whoever's marketing that product, can choose how to make that disclosure. And they can do a text on the package that would be the equivalent of what many of us think of as a label. They can do a symbol on the package, and I'll show you what that symbol is in a minute. Or they can do an electronic or digital link, so a QR code or a barcode or a smart label. And as Joan said, that's why it's called the disclosure law, because the information that's being provided to the consumer does not need to be on the package. It can be in an electronic form that the consumer has to then get to on a website. There also can be a phone number for a text message, and for small manufacturers, which are defined in the law and regulations as sales of, I think, $2.5 to $10 million a year, you have an 800 number or a website link on the package that they could also do. So there are a number of options, but the key point here is that it may not be on the label, it may not be on the package, which is why it's a disclosure law, and it is up to the food manufacturer. They have the choice of how they want to disclose this information. So I said the first option is the text option, and USDA said that they have to use the words either bioengineered food. That would be, for example, if you're buying frozen corn and the corn's genetically engineered, there's only one ingredient. So you would say this is a bioengineered food, or you would say contain bioengineered food ingredients. And you would do that if you, in fact, you had a multi-ingredient product where one or more of the ingredients came from a bioengineered crop or animal. USDA said that you cannot use the terms genetically modified, GMO, or genetically engineered. That was, again, controversial. The law allowed the Secretary of Agriculture the discretion to use other similar terms to bioengineered, but Secretary Perdue, under the Trump administration, decided that was not to be allowed, that everybody had to use the word bioengineered. So that's the text option. As I said, the second option is a symbol, and this was the final symbol that USDA designed, and a company could put this symbol on the package, or both in color or in black and white. The third option, as I said, is a QR code, and here's an example of a QR code, and later on you'll see some packages with QR codes on it. And so the manufacturer has to put both the QR code, and they also have to put this language: scan here for more information, or call 1-800 and provide that number. So it doesn't say scan here for bioengineered information, ingredient information. It just says scan here for more information. So if a consumer doesn't know that they're going to get bioengineered information from scanning this, they won't necessarily do that. Similarly, the QR code provides lots of other information, not just the bioengineered ingredient information. So those are the primary ways to do the mandatory disclosure. And I say this is a mandatory disclosure. It is required by law. The law, the regulations, USDA also allowed for some limited voluntary disclosures. So they allowed for very small manufacturers to disclose, so they're exempt. If you're a very small manufacturer with sales of less than $2.5 million, I believe, your products don't need to be disclosed, but you can voluntarily disclose them. And secondly, they allow voluntary disclosures for derived from ingredients. So what are those? So as I mentioned, corn is a genetically engineered crop. If you make oil from that corn, there's no modified DNA left in it. In fact, there's no DNA at all. And so corn oil would be an example of an ingredient that's derived from, it doesn't contain it, but any modified DNA, but it might be derived from genetically engineered corn. Similarly, we have sugar in our food supply. Some of it comes from sugar cane sugar. Some of it comes from sugar beets. Almost all of the sugar beets in the United States are genetically engineered. So if your sugar came from sugar beets, again, sugar is a chemical molecule. It has no DNA in it. So it doesn't have any modified DNA. So it could be considered a derived from ingredient. And so a company can, if they choose, say that their food has a derived from ingredient in it. Or as text on the package, they can also use this derived from symbol. And of course, they could do that also through the QR code. The one other thing I want to talk about with the law is the law doesn't apply to all the foods in the supermarket. So if you go to the supermarket, not all the foods are required to disclose under the law. The law is required for all foods that have labeling requirements under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So all FDA regulated foods. So for some of you who don't know, FDA regulates approximately 80% of a food supply in the United States. They regulate all the plants that we eat, all the fish that we eat, many of the products they eat. What they don't regulate is meat, poultry, and eggs. So they don't regulate beef, pork, poultry, sheep, lamb. They don't regulate eggs. That's the 20% of the food supply that USDA regulates. The law doesn't only applies to certain foods that are regulated by USDA. So it doesn't apply to all of them. And let me explain. So what you have to do is, if you were a food manufacturer deciding if you apply, is you have to figure out is the first ingredient in your product, and usually the first ingredients, the ingredients are listed by their how much there is in that food. So the first ingredient is the largest percentage of the food. So if your first food ingredient is a meat, poultry, or eggs, then you're not covered by this law. You don't have to disclose. But that doesn't end there. So if the first ingredient is broth, stock, water, or a similar solution, then you have to look at the second ingredient. So if the first ingredient is broth, and the second ingredient is meat, poultry, or eggs, then you're also not covered by the disclosure rule. You don't have to disclose. But if the first ingredient is broth and the second ingredient isn't meat, poultry, or eggs, then you are covered. So it depends on whether the first or the second ingredient is meat, poultry, or eggs, and it decides whether or not you're covered. So let me give you some examples. So here's some chunk white chicken, applewood smoked flavored, and you'll notice there, if you can see, the first ingredient is white chicken, so that product is not required to disclose. It's not covered by the law. So if any of the lesser ingredients in that food came from a genetically engineered crop and had modified DNA in it, they would not be required to disclose. They're not covered by the law. Here's another example. We have chunky spicy chicken noodle soup, and you'll see the first ingredient is chicken stock and the second ingredient is chicken meat. So here again, this would not be covered because the second ingredient is chicken meat and the first is chicken stock. If any of the following ingredients after that came from a genetically modified organism and they had DNA in them, they're not covered by this law. On the other hand, home style chicken noodle soup from Campbell's, you'll see here the first ingredient is chicken stock, the second ingredient is chicken noodles, and the third ingredient is chicken meat. This one is covered because it's the chicken is not the first or the second ingredient. Interestingly enough, if you'll look closely on this one, this does say contains bioengineered food ingredient in it, but so did the one that wasn't required to have disclosure, that's not covered by the law. So Campbell Soup has made a decision that they're just going to put this on any of their soups that have the modified ingredient, whether or not it's actually covered by the law or not covered by the law. My guess is this is probably going to be one of the most confusing aspects of the law to consumers because they wouldn't know. I mean, Campbell's has decided to do this, but if Campbell's decided not to do it, people might think there's a distinction between these two products on its bioengineering, when in fact it might not be. It's just that one is covered and one is not covered. So finally, I wanted to talk about exemptions from the disclosure. So, no law is, has 100% coverage. Sometimes there's always exemptions for things. And so this law is no different. So what did Congress exempt? So it exempted restaurant food. So food we eat in the restaurant is not covered by this. That would also include food trucks. It would also include if you in a supermarket and you're going to eat the food in the supermarket, like it's ready to eat food. So like if they have a little sushi bar, where you're buying sushi to go, those kind of products aren't covered by this law. It depends on, again, whether it's more of a restaurant food or more of a grocery store food. Animals that were fed GM feed are not covered by this law. And in fact, no labeling law around the world, I believe, covers that. As I mentioned earlier, very small manufacturers aren't covered by this law. And finally, there's a threshold requirement. So foods with less than 5% inadvertent or technically unavoidable bioengineered content for each ingredient is not covered. So what does that mean? So I'll make the distinction. So if you're a food and you have a little bit, and one of your ingredients is cornmeal, if you don't if you just buy generic cornmeal, then you're going to require it to be disclosed because some of that is probably going to come from a genetically engineered crop. But if you specifically try not to, if you try to get organic cornmeal that's not biotech, but there's a small amount in it that's inadvertent or technically unavoidable, as long as that's less than 5% of the total of that ingredient, then you don't need to disclose it. So it's sort of a de minimis kind of thing, but it does depend on whether it's inadvertent. If it's a small ingredient in the food, but you intended it to have biotech in it, then it has to be disclosed no matter how small that ingredient is in the food. So with that background, I the last couple of weeks went to two of my local grocery stores. I went to a Giant grocery store in McLean, Virginia, which is one of the biggest in their fleet. They're owned by Ahold. And I went to a Wegmans grocery store, and I said, how are food manufacturers disclosing these foods today? Which option are they doing and why? I mean, I couldn't answer the answer why, but which one were they disclosing? And so I'm going to now show you what I found from those trips. And it was a little surprising to me. It wasn't exactly what I expected. So my first observation was that the most common disclosure method was text on the package. So when this law was being discussed in Congress, it was very controversial having that electronic disclosure, and this being a disclosure law and not a labeling law. And many stakeholders felt that, in fact, companies would only do the electronic disclosures, and so the information wouldn't be available in the store. Well, my observations, and again, I only went to two stores, was that many national brands are actually putting that information on their package. So here's a General Mills cereal, and you'll see it says contain bioengineered food ingredients, and always this information is always going to be on the same panel, the same portion of the package that has the ingredient list. That is what the regulations talk about. So I found all the General Mills. I found this on many General Mills foods. So my assumption is that General Mills has made a corporate decision to provide this information on the package. That same thing I found for Ritz crackers, which is Mondelez, and they have lots of different foods in the supermarket. And I found other Mondelez foods that also have that. I went to Post cereal, and they also, as you see, it says contains genetically bioengineered food ingredients. And that was similar on other packages of Post. I found that on Kellogg's. Here they have contained bioengineered food ingredient, and also the same thing in Spanish. And so, so I found a number of the national brands. The same thing was true for Pepperidge Farm. There was a number of products. And so this was actually, I wouldn't say common on packages, but it was clearly the most common form of disclosure that I found out there. I also found it, Giant had made this decision on its store brand products, as well as Wegmans had made this decision on their store brand products. And I give two examples here, but I found other examples in the supermarket. So I think that was sort of a pleasant surprise to me, because I think the expectation was that many companies weren't going to do those on-package disclosures, more attuned to labeling than disclosure. There are some food companies that are using the electronic digital disclosure. I did find that at the supermarket. Again, it wasn't as common. And in fact, I didn't see as many smart labels or QR codes on packages generally as I thought I might find. That is, people talk about that as the future of getting information, but they were clearly on a minority of products around the supermarket. So here's an example. Tostitos corn chips was one of the products I looked at. This is a product that's produced by PepsiCo company. And you'll see there's the smart label, and you'll see it does say scan here for more information or call, and they provide an 800 number. And so I went and scanned that with my phone. It's a little difficult with some of these not flat surfaces, but I was able to do it, pretty easily. And this is what popped up on my screen. So I took a screenshot of exactly what popped up, and you'll see here, right here in the top third of the screen, you see the word the bioengineered symbol. So I was surprised, but interestingly, there were a lot of the electronic disclosures did use this symbol. And so I found that on other PepsiCo company products, and it's, again, seems like they've made a corporate decision to go this way, as opposed to going the disclosure on the package. I found that also for Quaker cereals. I think that's a ConAgra brand, but don't quote me on that. I can't remember. But there they have that. And then Utz, which is a potato chip and pretzel company. I'm not sure they're national, maybe more regional. And interesting, they used, again, what came up on my phone screen was this food contains bioengineered food ingredients right away. So I think there was another concern when this law was coming out in the regulations that somehow when you did use your smartphone and you went to the page, it would be hard to find this information. It would not be out there easy for a consumer to find. So that was not what I found. In fact, it was easy for the consumer to find. Whether they understand it is a whole different story. Whether they understand what this means is a different story, but at least it was transparent. I did look for the bioengineered symbol in the stores, and actually I couldn't find it anywhere. The only product that I found that has the bioengineered food symbol in both stores, and I looked pretty hard. Again, I didn't look at every SKU, I didn't look at every package in the store, but Impossible Foods, the Impossible Burger, all of their products have the bioengineered symbol on the package, and they've had those on for a couple of years now almost. So, but I could not find anywhere. So the symbol is used in some of the electronic disclosures, but it's not found in the supermarket. So if consumers are looking for this, they're not going to find this symbol, I don't think. I'm not sure why that's not being used by the companies, but for whatever reason, they've chosen not to use that as much as people might have thought they would have used it. So that's it. Interestingly enough, this symbol is on this package not because of the heme, the genetically engineered special ingredient that gives the Impossible Burger the ability to taste and bleed like a hamburger, but it's in there because of the soybeans that they use in the product. The heme would not be included because it's a protein. It doesn't have any modified DNA, so it would not be included as something that needed to be disclosed. I think that one's a little out of whack, and I apologize for that. So one of the other observations I had was that no products voluntarily disclose the derived from information. So as I mentioned before, one of the big fights was whether it included derived from ingredients, and one of the reasons is that many of the genetically engineered crops that we have today, the way they enter our food is in these derived from ingredients. So if those are covered or not covered meant a lot of disclosure or not disclosure. But there was this voluntary option. And what I found was I could not find any food in the store, electronic or otherwise, that had the voluntary disclosure. I couldn't find the derived from symbol. I couldn't find the words derived from on any product. And I couldn't find them online with any product. What I did find, though, was a lot of products that have ingredients that are derived from, that are highly processed, that don't have modified DNA, that did seem to disclose. And so this was one example, log cabin syrup, they have a disclosure there, but the only ingredient they really have is high fructose corn syrup, which was sugar. And that is a highly processed ingredient. Similarly, here was Wegmans home-style tapioca pudding. And if you look at the ingredients, it's whole milk, skim milk, sugar, modified tapioca starch, tapioca pearls. Those come from cassava, whole eggs, salt, butter, natural flavor, and coloring. None of those are modified DNA. The only potential thing is the sugar. And so this would normally be a derived from food, but instead they've decided to say contains a bioengineered food ingredient. So I've seen a lot of products where the companies made the decision not to use derived from, but seem to want to disclose the information. As a juxtaposition, Cozy Shack, which has tapioca pudding, they don't have a disclosure, but I also noticed they say that their sugar is specifically cane sugar, which means it comes from sugar cane, which is not genetically modified. So they don't have a derived from ingredient in their product. So again, that made me also think that the distinction is because of that. Similarly, again, Coca-Cola, this is their electronic disclosure. They're using the bioengineered, but when I look at all those ingredients, the only thing I really see are derived from ingredients. I don't see anything that would have modified DNA in it. Here was another example of Wegmans canola spray. The main ingredient is canola oil. There's also a lecithin from soybeans. I did some research. Lecithin from soybeans almost never has DNA in it, but it could have DNA. The canola oil probably comes from genetically engineered canola, but again, it's highly derived, no DNA. The lecithin comes from probably genetically modified soybeans, and it probably also doesn't have any DNA, but they did put contains bioengineered food ingredients here. So I think my observation from that is companies are being very conservative and being overly open in trying to be transparent, even with ingredients and products that probably may not qualify as being required disclosure. Finally, there's no information on which ingredients are bioengineered, and this is probably one of my criticisms of the law and the regulations is, the disclosure is sort of an on and off switch. You're either, if you have any ingredient that's bioengineered, then the product has the disclosure. If all the ingredients don't, then the product doesn't have the disclosure. But it doesn't tell the consumer which ingredients are disclosed. And to me, that's a lost opportunity to educate consumers about which ingredients are. And in some cases, they may be very minor ingredients. And so there isn't that opportunity. The only company that I'm aware of is Campbell's Soups. They do put information after their disclosure where they say the ingredients from corn, soy, and sugar in this product come from genetically modified crops. So they do add some additional information, but nobody else does. And there's no information there. And also on the QR codes, there's no real information additional about that. So to me, that's a lost opportunity to provide more information to consumers and to begin to educate people about what are the genetically engineered crops and how do they get into our food supply. If people see these disclosures, I think they're probably going to make misunderstandings about which of the ingredients are actually bioengineered. Finally, I'm always asked the question about what about non-GMO products? How do those fall into this law and regulation? So the law does have a specific provision about that. And it did say that any food, they said a food may not be considered to be not bioengineered or non-GMO if it, just because you can't call it non-GMO just because it doesn't require a bioengineered disclosure. So that may be a little confusing at first, but what it's saying is, there are products that have to be disclosed. Everything that doesn't have to be disclosed is not automatically non-GMO. And that makes sense because there are exemptions, there are de minimis, things like that. So they specifically say you can't call your food non-GMO just because just because you don't have to disclose. So that's the only thing the law says on this. So, what do we have in the marketplace? Many of you have seen there's the non-GMO project verified products, and there are lots of individual companies that have their own non-GMO certification system. This is not part of the USDA regulatory system. This is not part of any federal regulatory system. These are private or self-certifications. Each one uses its own standard of what they mean by non-GMO, and they self-determine if they've met those standards. So, my view on that is that they've been misleading in the past. They include things like orange juice as non-GMO when there's no GMO variety of orange juice, and all orange juice where the only ingredient is oranges is non-GMO. So they're misleading in that way. And in some instances, we don't know what they mean by this. So if I'm asked the question, I want to avoid GM ingredients, and everybody has a right to do what they want to do, I say then you should purchase USDA organic. So the law and regulations specifically say if you're certified organic, then you can't use GM seeds or animals in your production process or in any of your ingredients. And the law says that you're automatically you don't have to disclose. There's no requirement of disclosing because of that. And so that would be the way that somebody who wants to avoid bioengineering in this food supply would do it. So in conclusion, I'm going to I put together this graphic about what's the information in this area in the supermarket? What are consumers going to see? And on the left-hand side here, we've got requirements of disclosure. So they'll have disclosure of certain products will have disclosure. They'll either be bioengineered or contains bioengineered ingredients. It'll either be text or a symbol or scan here for information, or a text message. You'll have some things that have voluntary disclosure. Those could be derived from the highly processed ingredients, very small manufacturers. You'll have foods that aren't disclosed, but don't necessarily are not non-GMO because they're below the threshold, they're highly processed, or places where meat is the first ingredient or second ingredient after broth, where they don't fall under the requirements of the law. And then, of course, you'll have this whole sort of wild west of things that are non-GMO identified, some of which are more reputable or some of which are more verifiable than others. So that's sort of what the consumer is going to see in the supermarket and the variety of information in this area. And we'll see whether consumers, how they utilize this information, whether they understand this information moving forward. So I'm going to end there. And I hope that that's given people information about this law, and both about what it requires as well as how currently it's operating in practice, keeping in mind that my survey was not a scientific survey with going through QA, QC procedures or anything like that. This was very much a go to the supermarket, spend an hour or two going through the aisles and seeing what I find. I'll end it there, Joan.
Thank you, Greg. That was very interesting, and it's incredibly complicated too. So it's amazing that you've mastered all of these details on this very new rule. Looking at some of the examples you showed, I would have to say that I would think the presence of bioengineered ingredients would be the least of some people's concerns. I mean, it's like there's a heck of a lot of junk out there, but that's another topic. So based on what you've seen in the grocery stores, how meaningful is this disclosure to the consumers?
I mean, I don't know how meaningful it's going to be to the consumers. I think my overall view of this issue has always been there's a small segment of the consumers who care about this issue. And for that small segment of consumers who care about this issue, and within that small segment, there are people who care on both ends of the spectrum, put it. So there are some people who really want to avoid bioengineered foods, and there's also some people who really want to support bioengineered foods. And so I think for that small segment of consumers, this information is going to be helpful to them. Is it everything they want? Probably not. Is it in the form they all think is the best? Maybe, maybe not. But for consumers who this is an important issue to, this information will be helpful to them. And that's why I think this is a step in the right direction in terms of transparency. For the vast majority of other consumers, I've never thought that this was this was one of their key important issues when they purchase food. They purchase food, first and foremost, for the taste of that food, for the convenience of that food, for the price of that food, for cultural reasons, for nutritional reasons, for a host of other reasons. And so they might take this into consideration, but for many of them, I think this will not be information that they seek out or, gets really involved in their purchasing decisions.
Mm-hmm. Well, we have some questions here from our participants, our attendees. So one notes that it's interesting that Wegmans Food You Feel Good About includes the bioengineering disclosure. Do you have any insights into that decision?
So I don't have any insights into, and I have not called any of the companies to ask them why they made the decision they made, whether to do it on text on the package or whether to do the QR codes. So I could speculate. I happen to know Wegmans and the people who run Wegmans, and they've always been quite open about genetic engineering and biotechnology. In the past, they've had articles in their newsletter that they have for their customers. They've had frequently asked questions on their website about this. And so, they've always been open about it. So it's not surprising to me that they're open about it and chose to do it in that format. But I don't know really what went into that decision for them in particular.
Another person, this whole issue of using the word bioengineered has been, contentious, controversial, because some people felt that it was a way to try to hide GMOs. So, I mean, this person's asking, do you think consumers understand what bioengineered means?
So again, on the whole, I think consumers don't, really understand what that means. I was clearly, in my organization, the Center for Science of Open Interest, we're clearly supportive of the alternative, allowing for similar terms to be used in the disclosure. Not because we think GMO is a great term. We actually think that's not a great term. We think probably the most scientifically accurate term is genetically engineered, but because those are more familiar to consumers, and so therefore it might provide more information and might not be perceived by some consumers as trying to hide the information by coming up with a different term to utilize for the disclosure. We thought that was a negative thing. And there were a number of food manufacturers and food retailers who also wanted to use these other terms that, whether they agreed with, whether they were scientifically accurate, felt that that was what consumers know, and they wanted to be responsive to consumers and make the information more accessible to consumers. But as I mentioned, the Purdue administration, Secretary Purdue did not agree with that, and that was not the decision that was made. So I've advocated for some education around this. If we want to make this information useful to consumers, we need to educate them. And one of the key things would be educating about that term.
You know, now that that term is part of this disclosure law, do you see it be replacing GMOs in the popular lexicon?
I don't think so. I mean, the reality is that GMOs and genetic modification, genetic engineering are used throughout the United States, but also throughout the world. And so I don't see, it may become a similar term that people understand and more people use than have in the previously, but I don't see it as sort of becoming the term that everybody uses in all these other contexts.
Mm-hmm. So we have another question, and that is, what's the situation for genome edited foods?
So that was a question that was asked of USDA in their rulemaking process, and they sort of punted on that. They sort of didn't answer. They said, we'll have to look at each food on a case-by-case basis and make a decision about whether it qualifies. So I think one can interpret that, though, however, it says is it has to have modified DNA in it. So I think it will depend on what was done in the genome editing. If all they've done is silence a gene and not put any modified DNA in, then likely it will not be covered. The ingredients made from that crop or animal will likely not be covered in the standard. But if they do put some modified DNA in, if they clearly put a new gene in, that will definitely be covered. It gets dicey, I guess, when you start doing things like adding a base pair or correcting a mistake or something like that, whether that will be covered or not, or optimizing a gene that already exists there, will that be covered or not? We don't have foods like that in the food supply yet, so nobody's reached those issues.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So another question from the audience. Are you aware of any ongoing legal challenges to the law or to any products in the market?
So there is a legal challenge. The Center for Food Safety and a number of other NGOs and a number of companies, primarily in the natural foods area, did sue USDA, I don't know, maybe a year and a half ago or something, saying that on this law and regulations. And that suit is winding its way through the courts. I think it's been delayed a lot because of COVID, but it is winding its way through the courts. And some of the issues that they raise are issues like you did raise, Joan, or the questionnaire raised. They do raise the issue of the word bioengineered. They do raise the issue of the QR codes and consumers, some consumers not having cell phones or having access to the internet to get that information, and equity issues around that. They raise a number of constitutional claims about, whether you could, why you only can use certain terms and you can't use other terms, and free speech and so forth. I don't know the details of that litigation, but that litigation is ongoing. I'm not aware of any other cases challenging the rule itself, the rule and law itself. And I don't know if there's been anybody challenging companies' disclosures that have been made so far. There are a number of lawsuits out there generally for products that there's a lot of natural litigation. So there are companies that have been sued by people that call their product natural, and then somebody claims, but it can't be natural because it has a genetically engineered ingredient in it, type of thing. And there have been cases in that area out there in different states and courts.
Plenty to keep the lawyers busy. So do you expect that some international markets that typically follow USDA, FDA lead for their country regulations will be impacted by this law? And as in, might they also adopt the same regulations?
So I think if anything, there are, if you go to the Center for Food Safety's website, you see that they say that there are 60 or 70 countries around the world that have labeling laws already in place for bioengineered or genetically modified organisms. And so if anything, the US is late to the table. A lot of other countries already have things and they have different requirements. So I think the likelihood is that I don't think anybody's going to follow our lead on this. I don't think they're going to use the term bioengineered. And clearly, they're not going to do the kinds of distinctions that we've done in terms of what's exempt and what's covered and so forth. So I actually don't think that this will be followed by any of our partners. I think the more interesting issue is what happens with imported food that comes into the United States. So what about things that are labeled GMO or genetically modified in Europe? They now have to change the label to now say bioengineered because that's not the term they're allowed to use in the United States. So in some ways we've raised some issues about, and we have different definitions. So I think the more confusing thing is going to be if you go to the store and buy imported products, and those companies that are importing products to the United States have to deal with a different labeling scheme in this area.
It's great to see all these questions we're getting from people. You've really sparked their interest here. So here's one. The bar for containing engineered DNA in a product is a PCR test, which can amplify and find even a single strand of DNA. Is it realistic for any derived from or bioengineered foods, excluding highly processed products like oil, where DNA would be destroyed, to be fully free of engineered DNA?
So I'm going to have to state that I'm not sure I can answer this question completely. I haven't done as much research as I probably should do on this issue, but USDA has issued detailed guidance on how a company who has a highly processed ingredient can document that it doesn't contain modified DNA. I'm not sure whether a PCR test is the way that they do that. There are a number of ways they do it. One way is the general literature that would show, for example, that oil doesn't contain DNA, and so that's one way they can do it. They also can test their particular product batch and show that, and they can have a general test to show that. I don't know, again, whether it's a PCR test and exactly how the test runs, but I think that they understand that there are limits. That I've not heard from the industry that they are picking tests that would be overly difficult to do, and understanding that there may be some small amount of below the detection level of whatever the test they're doing that might have DNA there. That's not something that means that you then have to require disclosure.
So is the FDA considering changing its policies on labeling to be congruent with the USDA?
So the FDA, this applies to FDA foods, this requirement. It doesn't change any of the policies that I'm aware of that FDA has around this area. So FDA has not required mandatory disclosure of bioengineering unless there's a substantive difference in the characteristics of that food. And in which case that they've said that you have to identify the substantive characteristics, not necessarily that they were called, not necessarily that the reason for those substantive characteristic changes is bioengineering. So for example, if there was a high oleic oil that now fried at a different temperature or had different consistent properties for baking, you might have to identify that in the food, but you wouldn't have to identify that was bioengineered. So I'm not aware that would change. You would have to identify that as bioengineering if it qualified under the USDA rule. Similarly, FDA is the one who regulates those non-GMO claims, and their policy has been, you can't say your food is 100% GMO free, but you can say it wasn't made with, it's non-GMO project verified. You can say it's, it was made with non-GMO crops or something like that. You just can't guarantee 100%. And they've pretty much used their enforcement discretion to allow those disclosures to be made, and I don't see them changing that. So I don't think they're going to change any of their policies, and I think that their view would be their policies are consistent with this law and regulations.
You mentioned in your presentation that meat and poultry, those things are exempt. How is the Aqua Advantage fast-growing salmon going to be labeled?
So as I said, the law says that products that are primarily regulated by USDA, meat, poultry, and eggs, don't fall within this disclosure requirement. Fish is regulated by FDA. So fish is regulated under the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act. So they are required to be disclosed under this. So the Aqua Advantage salmon would require disclosure. If it was in a packaged product, it would have to be on the package. If it was at the counter of the seafood counter, for example, there would still need to be some label or distinction about it made available. Just there are regulations, for example, for bulk foods, or if you had the Arctic apple and you were buying the apples. I haven't read the details of those, exactly how you disclose it, whether it's on a sticker for the apple, or whether you would just put it next to the price of the product type of thing. But so the salmon would, if it's being sold in a supermarket, would be required to disclose. Right now, my understanding is the Aqua Advantage salmon is being sold to restaurants, and restaurants are serving it. Restaurant food is exempt. So restaurant food is not covered by this law and doesn't require disclosure. So for now, the Aqua Advantage salmon is exempted. But if it was in the Giant or the Wegmans, it would require disclosure. The only other, by the way, I just might mention, USDA does regulate catfish. So FDA regulates all fish and seafood except for catfish. Catfish is regulated by USDA. So if catfish was genetically engineered, catfish was the primary ingredient of a product, that would not be required to have disclosure. That would be treated as meat, poultry.
Do you anticipate that there will be any revisions to this law? I mean, perhaps to include restaurants and food trucks, or what if there's a new GM product that's introduced on the market? Would the law have to be revised to address it?
So for new products on the market, if we now had genetically engineered blueberries or something like that, all that happens is USDA updates its list on an annual basis of the foods, and the list is not exclusive. So USDA publishes the list as a convenience. But if a company knows that there's a bioengineered food that's not on that list, it still needs to disclose. So even if something's not on that list, if there were bioengineered blueberries out there today, they would have to disclose that even if it's not on the list. Hopefully USDA would get it on the list the next year. So there's no reason to amend the law because of new products coming onto the market. The law is comprehensive for any new product that might come on the market. I have not heard anything for Congress to interest in amending this law. It's just gone into practice. I would expect that anybody who wanted to amend the law, they would say, let's see how it operates in practice for a while before we would even consider amending the law. But this was not a law that many members of Congress wanted to vote on. It was a no-win situation in their minds for some of these things, and so I think that this is. I don't see any prospect for amending of this law anytime soon.
They won't be eager to revisit this discussion.
That's for sure.
So what's your expectation for regulating gene-edited products?
So that's a whole different story about regulation of those. I think that different countries are taking different perspectives on that. In the United States, we've heard from USDA about how they are going to treat some gene-edited products. They're going to exempt them from the regulations, and companies can self-determine whether they fall outside the regulations that USDA has for genetically modified plants in particular. That's not necessarily the case for microorganisms. EPA had a proposal out that was going to deal with some products that pesticidal plants that would be similar, that could be produced through gene editing, but that has never been finalized. I read just yesterday, FDA came out with its list of updating guidances this year that it's going to be proposing. And one of those was about gene edited.
And it did say that
One of those was about gene edited regulations. It was about how they would treat gene edited plants. So hopefully we'll get some information from FDA about how they might do that this coming year.
We had a question from Facebook, and that was, has there been any indication that this disclosure law is increasing the use of the non-GMO product label?
I don't know that. I don't follow the non-GMO product label. I don't know whether they've, there are when I looked last, they had 40 or 50,000 products that were covered by their system. I don't know if that's increased and increased, with this anticipation of this disclosure coming into effect or not. I can't answer that.
Mm-hmm. And then, do you think that companies will be reviewing their disclosure approach as time goes on, or do you think they're making their decisions now and this is what they're going to continue with?
I don't know. That's a good question. I mean, it does look like, major national companies have made a decision to disclose one way or the other, whether when they see their competitors doing it a different way, whether they decide to change it, I don't know. But, they've spent a lot of time and investment probably to doing it one way versus the other. They have a lot of packages in production with that for the immediate future. So I wouldn't see them, changing course in 2 months from now or 4 months from now, but whether, 2 years from now they decide, okay, we've now instituted QR codes nationwide on all of our products, and now we're going to switch it to that. I don't know.
Mm-hmm. That whole issue of the QR code, the smart labels, that was contentious for the reasons you mentioned, that some people felt it would exclude consumers. It also maybe was thrown out there just because people, it was a way to oppose the variety of options for disclosing. But, based on what you saw in the grocery store, I mean, do you really think that's an issue for people being able to access information through that code, or even just the use of that kind of a code?
I didn't have any trouble accessing the smart codes with my smartphone, but my Giant had, and my Wegmans has Wi-Fi, and I was able to do it on my smartphone. But I would expect that there would be some people who would have more trouble doing that. I'm not sure my parents, who are 85 and 90 years old, know what a QR code is and would know how to scan it if without me or my children, their grandchildren, telling them how to do it. So I think if independent of the bioengineered disclosure, there are reasons for QR codes to be helpful in providing consumers with information. For example, recall information. Wouldn't it be great if you were worried about whether your bag of lettuce was recalled? We've seen a lot of recalls recently of bagged lettuce. And wouldn't it be great if you could take your smartphone and do the QR code, and if it was in a lot that needed to be recalled, that would be the information, and you'd know either not to buy it or not to use it when at home. So I think the future is to use these codes for more information to consumers, independent of whether it's bioengineered. What kind of education and what kinds of systems we have to have in place to make those useful will take some working in terms of society.
We have another question from the audience. Is it fair to say that consumers have not rejected products that are labeled? And if so, what would be your expectation for the non-GMO certification market share?
I don't know whether consumers have rejected these products, and I'm not sure whether these new disclosures that have only been there for a month are changing what is done. I know that when products like Cheerios came out and said that their product was non-GMO, they made the original version of Cheerios non-GMO. My understanding was that they didn't get any jump in sales because they made it non-GMO. And I remember Post also had grape nuts, or one of their cereals that they chose to become non-GMO. And I don't think they made a change in sales. So, but different foods and different companies may be trying to put themselves with different consumers in different markets. And so that they may, and for niche markets or for some markets, that may make a difference. For others, it may not make a difference.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned, that animals fed GM feed that's not required to be disclosed. Is there any indication that there's any GM ingredient still present in the meat or the milk of animals that have fed on GM crops?
So there isn't any evidence of that, and we wouldn't expect to see any evidence of that. I mean, think of us. You eat a carrot. Does any of the carrot DNA end up in your body? I mean, we digest the carrot and we get the nutrients out of it, and what we don't digest comes out of our system, and we move on. And so the same thing with animals. If they're eating corn or soybeans that are genetically engineered or not genetically engineered, those do not change the genetics, the DNA, or that gets turned into muscle mass through their digestive system and the way that their cells work. So we wouldn't expect that. And as I mentioned in my talk earlier, I'm not aware of any country. As I mentioned, there are 60 or 70 countries that have different mandatory labeling or disclosure laws around these things. I'm not aware of any of them that require that animal products be labeled because those animals ate the feed that was genetically modified. Again, if the animal has been genetically modified, they would require disclosure, and that would be the case here for fish, because it doesn't necessarily apply to meat and poultry, but in other countries that would also be the case. But I'm not aware of anywhere that requires that food products from an animal be labeled or disclosed just because they ate GM feed.
Yeah, I mean, that seems reasonable if it's not showing up in their milk or meat then. But I'm sure some people would want to know that, but I guess it's really, you have to make a distinction somewhere.
Right. And again, some of those non-GMO certifications or programs might say you can't use animals that eat GM feed in those. But again, that's made for other reasons, not because of science of whether there's DNA or not there.
Mm-hmm. When you were talking a little bit about, like chicken doesn't have to be disclosed if it's the first ingredient. What if there was chicken that had been sauteed in GM canola oil? Does that have, but it's the first ingredient? Would they have to disclose that?
As long as the chicken is the first ingredient or the second ingredient after broth, water, or stock, then those are not covered by the law. So that's the whole point. That's the point I was trying to make is, if canola oil is the third ingredient and canola oil came from, and we assume that canola oil had DNA, I mean, it doesn't, but if we pretend that it had DNA, it wouldn't matter. That product does not need to, that product is not covered by the law. Now, USDA is in charge of labeling of those products. So like I said, so the Aqua Advantage salmon would be required to be disclosed because it's an FDA product. If we had chicken breasts and if we had a genetically engineered chicken out there, we don't currently, but let's say we had a genetically engineered chicken and you wanted to buy a genetically engineered chicken breast, USDA could require that to be labeled on the label. USDA has ultimate authority over what gets on the label of our chicken breasts, and they have the discretion to include that. And they could decide to do that. So just because it's not covered by this disclosure law doesn't mean that if there was a genetically engineered beef, meat, or poultry, that it wouldn't be disclosed. It's just covered under different laws, and USDA would make a policy decision whether to include it or not include it in the label that they would approve.
So, I mean, obviously there are a few things that aren't completely covered by the law, but do you think in general it addresses what needs to be dealt with?
This law is not about safety, and the preamble to the law says that specifically. These are all safe products. It's not about safety. It's about providing consumers information. And it was done in reaction to the fact that states were beginning to pass laws, and there was going to be a patchwork of laws that the industry couldn't deal with. Does it provide consumers some information? It does. Does it provide as much information as some of the consumers want? Probably not. Does it provide is the information easily accessible? Some of it is, maybe some of it isn't as easily accessible, but for people who want to know, is it reasonable for them to be able to find this information? Probably yes. So I think it provides more information than we had before this law. Is it a perfect law and regulatory system? Probably not, in some people's minds, but I think it does for people that think this information is important to them, again, on either side of the spectrum, because they want to buy these products or because they want to avoid these products. I think it does provide those consumers with useful information.
Okay, so my last question for you, Greg, is, so what is the penalty for non-compliance? I mean, do you think, are all the companies going along here, or who's really making sure that they are?
So the law really doesn't set up an enforcement mechanism. There's no penalties in the law for USDA to give if people violate the law. And USDA has stated that they're not going to go out in the supermarket like I did and check to see and then go to testing products to see if they have bioengineered ingredients in them or not. What they've said is if violations are brought to their attention, they will investigate those violations. And if they find those violations are in fact they find that the tips that they've gotten are in fact valid, that there is a violation, they will publish that information publicly, and they will alert the company about that, and so try to get them back into compliance. But there isn't any penalty associated with this, and USDA is not going to do any active enforcement, and as I might say. There is one mechanism. So states are not allowed to have laws on this area any longer because the federal law preempts state laws. But a state could pass a law that's identical to the federal law. And if they pass a law identical to the federal law, but it had penalties associated with it or enforcement associated with it, the state would be allowed to enforce. I'm not aware that any state's done that, but if they did do that, then that would be a different enforcement mechanism.
Well, Greg, thank you so much for sharing all your expertise and information on this. And I've learned a lot. It sounds like the people in the audience had too. And I want to thank all of them for their great questions too, making this a really useful session.
Well, thank you. I've enjoyed it. If I haven't answered anybody's questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'd be happy to try to answer them.
Okay, great. And we'll also be posting a recording of this on our website and our YouTube channel. So if you missed it or missed the whole thing or want to redo something, it'll be there in a day or so. All right. Thanks again, Greg. Thanks for everyone for joining AfS Live.